As the British fell, the cavalry entered the fray, and the mass of fighters were driven back to the embrace of their camp. The Romans made no distinction between warrior and follower. Men, women, and children were all put to the sword.
Now, what happened in the final battle was truly horrific. The Britons were gradually pushed back and back and back towards their wagon train, and they were crushed to death. And I think this is why Roman historians always insisted that the British casualties in this battle were enormous, running into thousands. These were not people who were necessarily killed with a sword or a javelin. I think they were crushed to death and they were asphyxiated, and it would have been horrible. It would have been rather like, dare I say, the Hillsborough football disaster, where these poor people had been crushed to death.
Tacitus claims an incredible 80,000 slain. Whatever the true cost, the British defeat was complete. What became of Boudica, it is not known, only that she survived the battle, but took her life later with poison.
We would dearly love to know what happened to this heroic figure of Boudica. Tacitus, and I don't doubt it for a minute, tells us that in despair she took her own life with poison at the final battle, and I think that's entirely in keeping with what we know about this formidable warrior. There is another tradition which says that she escaped the battlefield and died shortly afterwards of natural causes and had a magnificent funeral, which seems to me to be frankly unlikely. The fact is, we don't know for sure, but she certainly didn't survive the battle, and she certainly didn't fall into Roman hands.
The Roman casualties are said to have been about 400 killed, which, if we apply the usual ratio, means another 1,200 were wounded, giving a butcher's bill of about 16%. Serious losses for any army.
The Romans had been given a mauling, but what could they do to get their injured troops back into the front line? Well, in fact, the ancient Roman army had a surprisingly effective medical arm, as I was to find out.
Oof. So, typical stab wound, thrust wound from a sword. Yeah. What are our options then, Roger?
Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is to take the sword out, of course, but of course the soldier would have done that.
Right.
So the first thing we'll do, I think, is let's remove this sword. So that's gone in deep. So the first thing to do is to make sure that that wound is cleaned out. So I think we'll start by irrigating it. Okay. Now, bear in mind that on a real casualty, this is going to be covered in blood. So the first thing that we would do is to wash it with just water, okay, whatever water we have. Now we have to get the vinegar into there.
Vinegar,
now,
antiseptic.
Absolutely, yeah. It's going to sting.
It's going to sting, isn't it?
Basically, we'll put in acid.
This guy's alive.
Absolutely,
you know,
he's going to be screaming, he's going to be shouting at this point. We'll need a few assistants to hold him down. At this. And then we'll just place that syringe into the wound and we'll flush it through with the vinegar. So that's going to float a lot of dirt and a lot of muck
to the surface
out of it. To a degree, this has sterilised it. But what are we going to do if he's bleeding?
Yeah.
That's the question. Bear in mind again that we've got a field full of guys that need to be treated. So if I'm working fast, I'm going to use a cauterising iron. Okay. So that's a red hot iron. Yeah. So that's going to stop all the bleeding. But the problem is, of course, I've also burnt a lot of the tissue inside there. So that could set up an infection. This chap's lucky. Right. The bleeding isn't not too bad. Okay. It's pretty superficial. All right. But what I want to do is to encourage that wound to stop bleeding totally, if I possibly can. And I'll do that before I start to suture up the wound to close it.
Okay.
So what are we going to use for that? Well, we're going to use something very, very simple.
Okay, I wondered what these were.
We're going to use an egg.
Okay.
Okay.
And this is going to help stop the bleeding.
This will, and it's the white of the egg that we're looking for.
Okay.
And it's the albumin.
It forms
that
sort of
does
like a
the
layer.
trick.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
It forms a layer, and it works on the clotting matrix of the blood. So the next thing to consider now is actually stitching up this wound. So what this is going to do is bring the two parts of the wound together. So that should form a nice scar when it's healed. So what we need to do now is to dress it to protect it.
Yep.
So that should, hopefully, save his leg.
So this is obviously your common stab, thrusting wound from a sword, for instance. But what other injuries would they be facing?
What if you take a blow to the head?
Yeah. Now you're talking. What kind of? Yeah,
That's
what kind
right. Well, it depends then on how heavy the blow is. If it's a really hard blow, well, your troubles are over, to be honest. If it's a cracked skull, well, that's pretty serious as well. But if it's not a cracked skull, you can still die from the effects of the hematoma inside.
Right. So you need to get the pressure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we need to vent it out.
Okay.
And for that, we need a trephine.
I think I know which one it is as well.
You've got it.
It's this one here, isn't it? Look
It's
at
a little
that.
beauty, isn't it?
It's
And
like a little
that's-
drill.
That's right. It's a hole drill.
hand drill, yeah.
Exactly the same sort of drill that you might use for drilling a hole in a floorboard.
Yeah.
And that's
into
the same
somebody's
procedure as well.
head.
But first of all, you've got to have a haircut first.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid all your hair's got to come off.
Oh no, not the hair.
Oh, yes.
Not the hair.
And then we'll wash your head with vinegar in the Roman period as well. So that's going to degrease it and it'll clean it
so you'd
nicely.
be completely
Yeah.
bald.
And then we'll take one of our scalpels with an iron or a steel blade and we'll make a shaped cut. Now that's either a Y-shaped cut or a U-shaped cut
Okay.
on the side of your head and peel the scalp up out of the way.
Yeah.
And then we'll place the trephine onto the skull and if you see there's
Little serrated edges.
yeah, the serrated edges, but there's a little point in the centre there.
Yeah.
And that's going to give us our centre point. And we'll place that in and I'll very gently tap it in and we'll start to drill. Now what I might do is use a bow on this as well to speed it up a little bit.
Okay.
And we'll drill through the skull, through the bone, until we can remove that disc of bone.
Well, this whole process, I mean, the Romans were very, very good at things, but this whole process seems very difficult. How hard was it for people to learn this stuff?
Well, they had a very structured system to learn medicine, and there were various disciplines within medicine as well, with the eye doctors, ear doctors, chest doctors, and so on. It's all based on research, it's all based on experience. If it worked, they used it, even if they didn't understand why it worked, they would use it. And we don't really get back to this level of medicine until, well, about the 1800s.
Really? It had been no walkover. Paulinus' revenge was extreme. He laid waste the lands of the Iceni and their allies to such an extent that he was recalled to Rome before he went too far. His successor was more conciliatory and gave the defeated British peace with honour, and Pax Romana was restored once more.
The defeat of Boudica was absolute and total, and it's very easy to look back on history and think, well, it was inevitable, but in actual fact it wasn't. In Germany, only 50 years earlier, 3 legions had been wiped out by the Germans. The same thing could have happened in Britain if Boudica had gone about things rather differently, if she'd ambushed Suetonius instead of taking him on in full frontal combat. The consequences of the revolt were of huge significance for our national history. It settled the fate of Britain for the next 350 years. Any Britons who still hated the Romans, and there were plenty of them, realised that it was hopeless taking on the Romans in open battle.
The Battle of Watling Street could have easily seen Rome lose Britain. But in the end, it was the Roman superior military skill, organisation, weaponry and use of the environment that inflicted such a heavy defeat on the Britons that no serious rebellion would ever take place again against their rule. The figure of Boudica has been cemented into the fabric of the British consciousness as a romantic symbol of the struggle for freedom. But in the end, the reality is, true Roman military grit snuffed out that dream.